Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this first webinar of 2025. We have maybe an unusual topic for Museum Expert Talk, but very exciting one. And thanks to our partnership with Marsha and Avi, over the last years, we have been able to go beyond the topics that we explore regularly. And so this one is certainly not an exception. On the contrary, I'm really looking forward to hear that as the conversation. As most of you may know, I'm coming from the Science Museum field and really eager to hear what we're thinking art museums might mean, and if there is any kind of similarity to what may or may not happen in other museums in the world. But I'm not going to introduce the conversation. This Marsha is going to do that for us. She has put the panel together. She will introduce the topic and the speakers, and then after that, the conversation will go on. Please put your questions in the chat box. We will collect them at the end and answer them at the end. Colleen, from one of our volunteers, is watching them very carefully, and we make sure that we can answer most of the questions at the end. After the questions, Avi will then make some closing remarks and what his take is of what he has heard during this coming hour. So thanks again for being here, and I'm handing it over to Marsha now for the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Walter. I know it's a pleasure for Avi and me to be here, and we are so excited about the conversation we're going to be having with Julie, Cindy, and Brian. It's now been 4 years since Avi and Ken Yellis and I began our work with on what became Changes Required, Preparing for the Post-Pandemic Museum. And in that volume, each of our speakers contributed an essay. So it's kind of exciting for us to revisit 4 years later each of our panelists, two of whom are in different positions. One is in the same position, but in quite a different place in that museum's life cycle. And so I think everyone agrees that a lot has happened in those 4 years. I know I started my career in an art museum. The Taft Museum in Cincinnati was my first museum job, although I've worked in many, many different kinds of museums. And Walter, I do think that the collections may be the same, the buildings may be different, rather, the buildings might be different, but some of the same issues, I think, translate not very well into the new museum space. So just briefly, our panelists today are Cindy Foley, when was at the Columbus Museum of Art in writing her essay, she called it Courageous Imagination at the Columbus Museum of Art. And now Cindy's the director, the CEO of the Grand Rapids Art Museum in Michigan. Brian Wiesenhunt was the CEO at the Rockwell Museum in Corning, New York, when he was kind enough to pen his essay for our book, which at that point, his essay was called Equity and Collaboration, Transforming Structure and Narrative to Center Community. And Juliana Ochs Dweck was the chief curator at the Princeton Art Museum then. She is still in that position, but I think, as we'll hear from her, the museum is in a quite different place as it's about to open sometime this fall. And her essay was called Collaborative Knowledge Production for the 21st Century Museum. So we welcome you all, and we're really looking forward to this conversation. I guess I'll start by asking you to, comment. And maybe I'll start with you, Cindy. This notion of the encyclopedic art museum, as you had your career, not, of course, both in Columbus, that's where I first got to know you, and now here in Grand Rapids, where you've taken the helm. I want to make some comments about how you're defining that for yourself in this particular role.
Yeah, well, thank you all for inviting me. And I'll just make one quick statement. It was about 4 years ago that we were all writing these essays and thinking about a post-pandemic world. And I'll admit to you all, 4 years later, I have not had COVID since then, and I have it today. And it's just a real interesting roundabout moment that, yeah, we're living in a post-pandemic world, but we still now have, the opportunity to zoom in and join you all from our bedrooms. So glad to be with you all today. And if I get a little coffee, I'll be turning off my volume. But to go to your point about encyclopedic museums, I think in Columbus, we were thinking differently about the role a museum plays in the 21st century. And, you know, the museum I was in and the museum I'm in now don't have that encyclopedic depth. And so even in Columbus, we were trying to determine what does a museum do with its collection rather than what do we need to collect or what gaps do we need to fill? What is its purpose and value in a community? And I think now that I'm in Grand Rapids, I'm even going a little bit deeper to think about when a community is so responsible for so much of your collections, it says a lot about your community and what you've acquired and what they value. But then what do you do when you need to actually have diversity and equity within your collection? And I think that's a challenge that probably Brian and Juliana and I have all grappled with, is that no matter how you think about your collection, it it may not do what it needs to do in the moment that we're living in today. And the question I think we're all asking ourselves is that a shift? Do we sell things? Do we try to buy new things? How do we make an encyclopedic museum and its collection work for communities? So I don't think I answered the question, but maybe teed it up for others to start thinking.
Yeah. And I think, Brian, you've been in your position less than a year, I think. But you talked a lot about that in the original essay. And now I'd love you to comment on what Cindy's saying about the community and the collection.
I think that's the question a lot of museums have been asking, is if the collection does not reflect the community it serves, how do we change that? Not just through the work and the perspectives it's represented, but also through interpretation. And during my time at the Rockwell, that was one of the things that we really worked to do. Number one, to diversify the collection. And in that 7 years, we added about 400 works to the collection. 65% of which represented diverse perspectives. I'm really proud of the work that the team did during that time to bring those new ideas, thoughts, and visions to the galleries. But at the same moment, we also worked intentionally with the team, with our community, with our board on interpretation and the voices that work within the galleries talking about those works of art. So it's not just what is represented, but who is given the agency to interpret them. And that's also what I've stepped into at Gilcrease in Tulsa, kind of at the very end of all the work that they're doing on the interpretive plan and new galleries for the museum, which will open to the community next year, is really all along and throughout this process, I've been engaging with the community on the decisions that were made around what's included in those galleries, how it's interpreted, how we're talking about it, and how it's being shown.
Great, thank you. And Julie, your new museum is going to be the heart of the campus. So you've got a campus community and you have a beyond campus community. You're at the point where you're asking, as you mentioned, I think some different questions than you were asking back when you wrote your essay. I'd love you to comment on this, on that point about what encyclopedic means for you now at the museum and how you're thinking about some of those issues of community collections, interpretation, and voice.
Fantastic. You've touched on all the issues that I think about all day long. So thank you, Marsha, for the opportunity. And what Brian and Cindy are saying really resonate with me. And I'll just mention where I'm coming from right now, which is that this coming fall, which I can finally say, in the fall 2025, the Princeton University Art Museum will be opening an entirely new building in the same location that will roughly double the spaces for exhibition, conservation, study, and interpretation of the museum's collections, with more robust opportunities for special exhibitions and public programs and teaching. So we're at a very, very exciting moment coming out of 5 years now of sort of existential self-reflection and a sort of collaborative journey. And a lot of it has been thinking about what sort of the inheritance of what it means to be an encyclopedic museum or a global museum. The Princeton University Art Museum has long been proud of and committed to its global reach, to its identity as an encyclopedic museum. But of course, the very concept of comprehensive and universal knowledge is being interrogated. And as Cindy mentioned, any encyclopedic museum inevitably has sort of a host of lacunae or ellipses, gaps in geography or identity or medium that are products of history and power. And I think that, while very proud of this history, I think we're realizing that today to be an encyclopedic museum refers not just to the scope of our collections, but to our methodologies, to the ways that we work, to our values of transparency and care for objects and people and institutional self-reflexivity. I think it means sort of positioning ourselves not just as repositories of property, but as facilitators of dialogue and discovery and knowledge co-production. And a lot of this can happen not only, as you're already suggesting, through hiring, through collections building, but also through new ways of interpreting the existing collection, ways to sort of complicate or expand conventional canonical narratives to ensure that issues of gender, sexuality, race, racialization, colonialism are interwoven into our galleries, into our themes in nuanced ways, and really ensuring that visitors' experiences in the galleries and that our scholarly work is multivocal, that there isn't sort of a single museum authority who is speaking, on behalf of an institution, but that there's an array of voices and expertise and sort of community presence, community members who help interpret works in the galleries and therefore help visitors sort of find themselves in the experience of the galleries.
So Julie, could you give me an example? Is there with a specific work that would provide a little more explication for the people who are participating in the webinar? I know you on the spot a bit.
I'll just say in general that we're one of the sort of approaches to interpreting art in the galleries to label writing is that they're being written not just by our team of 15 curators, but that we've solicited input from experts very broadly defined, faculty on campus, students, makers, community knowledge bearers, and they've all participated in the label writing process and really teach us along the way. I think it's taken a long time, but our field is finally realizing that one doesn't need to have a PhD in art history in order to be a knowledge bearer. And in fact, we can't do our work. We don't really understand our collections until we've engaged with sort of community knowledge bearers. So we have 4,000 objects at least presented in our new building, and dozens of them meaning is made of them by voices and experts from outside of the institution.
Great, thank you.
Marsha?
Go ahead.
No, I'd love to riff on this a little bit because I think every community is going to kind of take a different approach, and that's what's interesting. 5 years later, after the book was written, is how much I think we are thinking about the needs of our particular community. So I'm in Grand Rapids, and I'll just give you one example of a shift that we've made that I think was really catalyzed by this huge shift in society and culture in this past 5 years. And that is, we were not having transparent conversations, sometimes even with our own staffs, but definitely not with the community about some of the challenges that are inherent with museums. We just weren't talking about it. We knew about it. Leadership knew about it. We were getting on calls maybe and talking to like-minded folks about those issues, but we weren't then sharing some of those challenges with our boards sometimes, and we weren't definitely sharing them with our community. One shift that we made, and it was, it felt a little risky at the time. I'm really glad we did it now, is we decided to launch a diversity and equity fund. And what we had to do to launch that is to bring together a huge portion of our community for a party. And part of that party was to announce, it was a party and an artist talk, but it was to kind of say, Graham needs to do better, but we have some challenges. 80% of our collection is white males. And if we're going to really represent the community in which we live, the state in which we live, we need to make changes. What we then told our community is that something they didn't know, many staff didn't know, that the money we have to purchase art, a huge portion of that is already earmarked. And that was donors from before who had said, you know what, I love Impressionism, and I'm going to give you maybe $1 million to purchase art from, this particular time frame, and I have an idea of what I want you to purchase. And that was years ago. But that's how systemic racism shows up in museums, and we weren't sharing that. So that night we launched a fund, and we told the group that anyone who gave at any level, we would be using that money to purchase art that would diversify our collection, and we would acknowledge everyone on the first purchase. And it not only created a fund that now we can channel those monies when people are asked. We have a fund at the museum, but it started a conversation, and I think that's maybe the biggest difference I'm noticing now is, even though it puts us in a vulnerable spot, we're more willing to be in conversation with our community.
That's great. Did you encounter much resistance or any resistance?
I had maybe some folks on staff who were a little worried, like, some of our older donors might, feel a little off-put by this. So we were delicate, but no, if anything, it actually launched another fund that a board member decided she was going to fundraise to purchase a Black Michigan artist every year, and that she would take that on herself. So just the conversation actually then snowballed, and we started to see kind of an avalanche of community engagement and support around what we collect and how we collect it.
So Brian, you mentioned in the intro how many works you added to your collection when you were in New York. And I know your museum is not open public at this point, but maybe I'd love you to talk a little bit more about the nature of the collections that you have and how you're approaching some of these same issues that both Julie and Cindy have described.
Well, the Gilcrease collection is a little different than the Rockwell, first of all, in its size and scope. And Gilcrease has historically been known for its collection of paintings and artwork depicting the American West, and secondarily for its collection of indigenous material. But historically, the museum has siloed these aspects and areas of the collection. And in addition to that, we have a huge archive of historic material as well as an archaeological collection. So it's over 350,000 objects that is not limited to the history and story of the American West, but tells a story of the Western Hemisphere. And so really what we have tried to do, what the Gilcrease team has tried to do, that I'm seeing through over the finish line, is to kind of break down the barriers between those disciplines as well as those stories, because many of these histories are intrinsically linked. And often whenever we're interpreting them and talking about them in museums and museum spaces, because of the limitations we have in time and language and length of labels and the limitations we put on ourselves, we aren't always able to make those connections in a way that allows our visitors to approach them. So that's one of the things the Gilcrease team has really emphasized with this new installation of the permanent collection, is to show that interconnectedness, to draw lines between those histories, and also, again, to break down those barriers between the disciplines within the museum itself.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, because I remember, Julie, in your essay, and you've talked a little bit about how it's evolved. as even as part of your planning, this idea of cross-disciplinarity was core to just thinking through the everything about the museum when everything was still on the drawing board.
Yes, I like your phrase, thinking through the everything. That is definitely what we did. So Princeton has a collection of 115, now I think 117,000 objects, growing by hundreds and hundreds every year. So it's a large collection that covers most of the globe, and spans, I think, 5,000 years of human history. And so there's this huge question when you're beginning with an open set of 32 galleries, how do you organize this information? You know, on the one hand, we want to sort of break down silos of knowledge and presumptions about how geographies are bounded and cultures are bounded. At the same time, you know, visitors need their hand held in some way. So they need some kind of path, if not a predetermined narrative, then at least you know, to be taken on some kind of journey, even if it's inflected by their own you know, choices. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how to both respect histories of collecting within particular geographies, chronologies, and medium, but also to cut across these. And so we have, you know, 32 collections galleries across the building, and many of them are dominated by particular collecting areas, say by American art or ancient American art or indigenous North American art or modern contemporary. But every gallery has admixture, is representing not just a range of media, but also making juxtapositions transhistorically and cross-culturally, in addition to galleries where we are experimenting more pointedly with sort of thematic, maybe not thematic, but sort of questions, inquiries about ways of representing the world or experience. And I think it's been those cross-collections juxtapositions that have been really exciting. You know, it's all happening sort of in our curatorial minds. We have not yet welcomed visitors into the building, but I think it will be very exciting for them to see, for example, an 18th century Ethiopian Bible in the European gallery, to see medieval French ivory in the African gallery for a discussion about, in both cases, discussions of trade and the circulation of ideas and materials. And those kinds of sort of juxtapositions that might initially be unexpected are actually so inherent to the histories of these objects, and I think will be very exciting ways of presenting the works in the new building, and also facilitating teaching. Teaching doesn't, you know, on the one hand, you know, we're an academic museum and we need to support the teaching of American art history and ancient Mediterranean art, but teaching doesn't happen within these sort of boundaries of collecting that have sort of followed the, you know, the history of museums over the course of the last 200 years. And so by sort of taking a both and approach, respecting, you know, place and materiality, but also creating conversations about sort of diaspora and migration of ideas and materials, we hope that will hold visitors' hands, but also create surprises along the way.
It's great. And you know, I know that the museum physically is at the heart of the campus. So, and when we had a brief conversation as we were thinking about this webinar, I think everybody said something about museum as place. I know in Cindy's museum, the first thing you read on the website is more than a museum. And Brian, I know that you are doing a lot of work outside of the physical museum. So I would love, you know, I'm part of another, I'm on the board of another museum, a small local museum. And we had some people talking about community engagement. We had some surveys done. And this guy kept using community engagement. And one of the board members, who is a business person, she just raised her hand and she said, "Will someone please tell me what community engagement is?" And I thought, yeah, that was probably not a bad question. So maybe I'll put that question to you in terms of what you are doing in your respective museums. Since we throw that phrase around all the time, what do you mean by it, Cindy, in Grand Rapids?
Yeah, great question. And I might talk too long, so cut me off. Because one of the things we realized really early on after I started is that we were trying to do community engagement in adding it on to other people's jobs. We're small enough that we didn't have that position and that intentionality. So we just would see if membership could do that. Could the learning and creativity team do a little bit more? And it was working. But we decided, even though we didn't feel we exactly had the money to do it, we wanted to launch a new division called community engagement. And in doing so, we forced ourselves to define what that work would be. So I'll give you the four pillars of that work. So the first thing is meet people where they are. And that is just, if people are looking for a place to come on a Thursday night and socialize, let's start there. And what kind of experiences and events can we meet people where maybe they are looking for social engagement, maybe they are looking for a place to play chess? Then let's just be a place where that can take place. The second pillar of our work is health and well-being. Of course, this is on everybody's tongue right now. We know as the research keeps coming out that we are places of healing. So where do we partner? How do we create connections for meditation and well-being, sound therapy in our galleries? How do we target specific audiences, and how do we then open that up to much bigger audiences? The fourth pillar for us is called seeding change. And seeding change is about us realizing that there may be conversations that need to be taking place in our community, that there is no other place where they can take place. And sometimes we need to be the ones to do that. And sometimes they will have a connection to a work of art in our collection, or they'll have a connection to an exhibition. Sometimes they don't. But we know that this is something artists think about. And as a creative institution, we can be that place where we're bringing folks together around big, gnarly challenges maybe our community faces. And then that fourth pillar that we're really, really focusing on is our creative community. So what is the role of the art museum, not only to put on exhibitions and show our permanent collection and collect, but to lift up the incredible swath of creative potential in individuals that live within your own community. And sometimes that is hosting pop-ups. Sometimes that is giving an artist who does performance-based work the opportunity to work in our lobby. It can, but it has to be us open to new opportunities all the time to lift up that creative community. So that's how we're thinking about it, Marsha.
Well, I have to say, personally, I'm just really happy that creativity is still in there, Cindy. And it's really fascinating to hear how you've defined it in some very specific ways, because I think sometimes we're way too glib in using that phrase and expecting people to know what we mean, including people on our staff, for example. Brian, how does community engagement factor into the Gilcrease these days?
Well, I think for me, and just building on what Cindy shared, I think community engagement begins with the community, and it's about what the communities, and I prefer to use the plural because it's not the communities that surround the museum are not a monolith. They're not one group of people, but multitudes, and some of there's overlapping connections between all of them. So I prefer to use communities, and I think it begins with their desires, the things that they are interested in, the ways that they wish to connect with the museum, rather than what I think they should take from the museum. And Gilcrease is kind of in an interesting place, perhaps one that no museum has ever found itself in, because our construction, our building will be completed early this year in the next month. But we won't open until late 26. And so we kind of have this gap where we're reinstalling the collection. We are moving our collection to the collection storage, but the building itself will not be open or activated. So we have a program that we've launched called Uncrease. So it's a little different approach than Gilcrease has taken in the past. And we've actually invited our community to propose what they would do in this space over the course of 6 months. We'll be open a couple of days each month, and we're open to whatever ideas that you would bring to us. And it's really looking at how do we activate the space? How do we begin to build a connection with this new space for the museum? How do we restart those relationships? But it also establishes a new tone and builds on the collaborative history of the museum and that we're looking to the community to help us understand how our work should be approached, the things that we should bring to the communities of Tulsa, and not just bringing it from within ourselves and what we think from our own experiences and our own education and our own knowledge in the museum, but rather starting with them. So it's a really interesting idea, and it comes out of work that we did at the Rockwell. We did a similar program, which again was inspired by a program the Sheldon Museum of Art did, I think about 10 years ago, called the Naked Museum. So it's a way to rethink how museum spaces can be used and represent communities beyond just collections, interpretation, and exhibitions. I'll put the link to our proposal, which is a little bit more color to this program in the chat.
That'd be great. I was also going to ask you to just say a little bit more about, the specific communities that in which you are sort of physically spaced, and then some of the work that you mentioned that you've already been taking out around the neighborhoods. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that notion of the porosity of your boundaries is really interesting to me.
It is, and I think also just thinking about the identity of the museum, the Gilcrease collection was created by Thomas Gilcrease, and we believe it is the only museum collection in the United States that was compiled by an Indigenous person. So that is the root and origins of who we are as an institution. Mr. Gilcrease was a citizen of the Muskogee Nation, and our museum is located within the boundaries of the Osage Nation Reservation. It is very close to both the Muskogee Nation as well as the Cherokee Nation. At the same time, we are in what is considered the northwest area of Tulsa. So we are adjacent to North Tulsa, which is historically the African-American community. And that community has not always felt welcome in our museum and many other museums. And so it's something that we're thinking about. It's sort of like a nesting doll, I guess, and as far as like who your institution is and how it connects to and relates to not just in the place and the geography, but rather also the history of your institution, its founders, and people who have led it throughout the time that it's been active.
Interesting. Thank you. Julie, I was just thinking, you mentioned teaching, which obviously is very important at a university museum. And I just wonder, as you think about audiences, you've got faculty, you've got students, and you've got a greater Princeton community. Do you want to say something about how that has factored into some of the work that you've been doing and the decisions about the installation and programs?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think at Princeton that our possibilities and our commitments to community engagement are so inherently inflected by the fact that we're a university museum, that we're embedded in a college campus, that we are a place committed to teaching and learning, and that interdisciplinarity and expertise, but also sort of broad collaborative learning is sort of so inherent in who we are as an institution. And in fact, actually engaging very deeply with sort of wide-ranging expertise on campus and in the field, and working closely with students was sort of part of our planning process for the new building. And I see that as an important form of community engagement in itself. I think consultation, sort of being consultative, is sort of, I think, one of the ethical imperatives of engaging your communities. And so, as I think I might have written about in this essay, in these early days, these early months, years of re-envisioning our building, we developed a range of sort of advisory or working groups to begin discussion and to make recommendations for the conceptual and spatial ways that our collections would manifest in the new building. And so we had regular meetings. They were with campus, with faculty, with scholars in the library, with others on campus, with community members, and we met regularly through a sort of a series of presentations and listening sessions, investigation into pressing issues, and these helped us determine how to do better to present new narratives, and how to cover areas of expertise that we hadn't necessarily or the institution hadn't been able to support over the years. One especially exciting and productive, I think, set of community engagement sessions was to focus on the representation of Latin American and Latinx art and experience, which is a robust area of our collection, but not an area that is reinforced by curatorial expertise, and an area that hasn't historically in our building had its own dedicated gallery. And so we had these really exciting sessions on Zoom and sort of deep, dark days of the pandemic, sort of rays of light, where we talked about issues like decolonial approaches, dialogues between global modernism and indigenous traditions, sort of articulations of multiple possible futures. And the result was both wonderful collegiality, but also very tangibly a gallery for Latin American art in the new building, as well as the presence for Latin American and Latinx art and material culture across many galleries. So it really was sort of this very tangible moment where we couldn't grow and change as an institution without these community consultations.
Great. Thank you. You're making me think about, I mean, each of you, obviously with your own orientation toward leadership and your own experience in the museum world, you're at the helm of some really, really important and dramatic events and changes. And so I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on your style, your leadership style. I mean, it's easy for me to applaud everything you're all doing, and you make it sound so easy. I suspect that if you've had encountered institutions where there have been a little more hierarchical org charts, it's not really that easy all the time. So I'd love to ask you about that. And then, since I'm watching the clock a little bit, maybe you could segue into sort of what keeps you up at night as you implement your wonderful visions. So maybe in this case, I'll start with you, Brian, since I'm sure you sleep a good 10 hours every night. But if you could just present that something kept you up at night.
I do dream about sleeping 10 hours a night and the couple of hours I sleep. So that's what I dream about. I think, thinking about, we've spoken a lot about the external relations and what's happening within the museum space, but I think the other part of this story that we're discussing is also our internal structures. And if we're bringing this care to our communities and the relationship with our communities, we also have to consider our internal community of our team, our boards, our volunteers, and our councils. And I think that that's something that there's been a lot of discussion about within art museums in the last few years, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I think if we want to show love for the people who come to the museums, for the communities that we serve, for our visitors, we also have to do that same thing for the people who are inside the museum. And it's something we had a lot of conversation about here at Gilcrease yesterday. We were doing a team building workshop in the afternoon. So some of these thoughts definitely come out of that. But for me, my practice has always been highly collaborative and has evolved and become refined in the different roles and different museums that I've worked at, and had the opportunity at Rockwell with that team to really refine how we work together and to bring intention not just to our meeting structure, but also to our communication and transparency around it. We're taking some of those same ideas and trying to build that structure here at Gilcrease. And so there's, I think, a challenge there, and it's something that does take a lot of effort. It does take a lot of consideration, and it does take more time. It's easier to tell people what to do than it is to have a conversation with them about what should be done. And so that's something we always recognize when we're talking about collaboration, whether it's internal and external. It takes more time, but the results, the product, and the experience, in my opinion, is much improved, rather than taking a dictatorial approach where we're saying, you should do this, or we will do this for you, or we will look to do this in the future when we have time to do it.
Well, and Nancy Proctor just gave you an amen, and I suspect that many of the other people attending are feeling the same thing. It does take time, but I think it probably does pay off. So Julie, my ex-husband was an academic, and he talked a lot about politics within the academy. Maybe that doesn't happen anymore. And but in your cross-disciplinarity and your egalitarian approach to this massive project, do you have anything that keeps you up at night, or how have you honed your style?
I have no idea what your ex-husband is talking about. There's no academic politics at Princeton, nor does it encroach on the museum at all. But but I do spend a lot of time thinking about expertise and how to empower curators, scholars who are trained, who are expected, who are sort of whose fields are defined very narrowly. That is what they're expected to do, and yet for an institution whose scope is sort of ever growing. So within my staff of curators, part of what I'm doing is creating possibilities for them, sort of the conditions of possibility for them to grow as experts, for them to expand their knowledge sets beyond particular bounded time periods, media, et cetera. And part of this is a matter of simply empowerment, but it's also through creating a culture with some degree of urgency of collaboration, of working closely with other curators, which is not a given at institutions like mine. That a curator of photography will collaborate with a curator of ancient Asian art to collect contemporary Chinese photography. We're doing things like that, but it's something new and incredibly exciting. But I think it's also it's been important for us to realize that sometimes we do need to expand our staff. We need to hire anew in order to bring in new skill sets and new areas of expertise. And that's been the case for us very excitingly just in recent years for African arts. We now have a curator for African art, and also very recently in our hiring a curator of provenance. Which is, a trend sort of sweeping across the museum field, and so essential to us as we conduct research on existing collections, on potential new acquisitions, to make sure that we're meeting the requirements imposed by law and cultural convention, and those that sort of adhere to ethical concerns. And that falls into the category of keeping me up at night. I would say, how to ensure that we're meeting and exceeding legal and ethical collecting expectations. How are we, defining those very categories in the process of adhering to them?
Wow, thank you very much. That's the first time hadn't heard that title before, that job title. Really interesting. Curator of Provenance. Thank you. And Cindy, you've been hanging on. Thank you so much. I just wondered about, when you're at peak health.
Yeah.
What's on your
Not
mind?
knocking myself out with Benadryl, right? Yeah. What am I not sleeping? Well, and this is all, friends and family here. So let's just say it. I worry about money, and I worry about the continuity of our institutions. And I think for me, being a new director, 18 months in, I realized just how fragile our museums are, and many of them are, with their state of funding and the state of politics, and that we are easily finding ourselves in the crosshairs of the political situation. As we continue to show the work of artists that are talking about the issues that need to be discussed, we find ourselves, asking questions about who our donors are and how do we continue to stay afloat without them, possibly. In Grand Rapids, we have seen donors leave when we decided to do a significant exhibition that looked at queer vulnerability. It wasn't sexuality, it was just vulnerability. And we've had to say, okay, some of those donors, it just is what it is. But those who didn't leave us, we can't just say goodbye to all our donors that don't like all the shows that we do. And so how do we navigate that? And I think that's probably the thing that keeps me up almost every night is I've got the museum is the space for us to have these dialogues, the conversations that need to take place, and we can't do it without money. So, it means I'm doing something I never have. I'm working with a lobbyist firm to see if I can improve our public funding. I'm, rallying locals, other local art leaders to see if we can work on public funding for the sector. because I know that we can't keep doing business the way we've done it in the past. So
Thank you for that. I wonder, I don't know that, let's see, I'm looking for questions. Someone asks, do you agree with the statement, not all money is good money, as much as we as nonprofits do rely on donors? And I guess I was also going to add whether some of this issue could be ameliorated a bit by some of the collaborations and partnerships and support that you all are forging. But Walter, do you want to make some comments now, or can we turn it over to Avi? Or other questions?
Oh, well, yeah. First of all, I have to say I'll take over from Colleen, because one of the things that happens during this thing is that she lost power in her house. So we have a few challenges, but we so far I think it went very great, and I'm really excited about all the interesting things that I've been hearing. So um, I see a question here. We are seeing business in the news abandoning DEI policies. Do museums have a responsibility to vocally and publicly continue this work? And if that was not in the chat, I would have asked him. So, any of you, any remarks on this? Because this is a bit the elephant in the room.
I think it's definitely been something we've talked about at Gilcrease, especially in our state, where the educators are very limited on some of the approaches they can take on some of these topics, and we are not. And so we hope that we can continue to be a space where these histories are discussed in greater detail, and our audiences, regardless of their age, are introduced to them in an avenue and forum to discuss them. So I think we see our role is even more essential, although it is a very, challenging line to walk as far as sharing those histories and not raising the ire of those who don't want them discussed.
I wonder, I was in a meeting where a museum director said a lot of what she's doing is changing language, even though she's not changing policy or practice. So just, like, and if for this person who is in upstate New York, this was effective. In other words, not pulling back on any policy, but not labeling it quite the same way. But I'd love to hear from Cindy and Julie about that too.
yeah, I think.
Yeah, Julie. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I think we're all learning together how to forge forward, and we're paying a lot of attention to universities. We're paying a lot of attention to libraries. We're seeing what's happening. At the end of the day, we are responsible for institutions and their survival and thriving. But we have to stick to our missions, and we will continue to do the work. So, workarounds are everything right now. Probably 2 years ago, we would have done a drag night and not think anything of it. Today, if we're doing a drag event, we're going to have conversations about where we're going to market that, how are we going to market it, who does it go to? I mean, it's just, it's a different moment. So I don't know if I have an easy answer. Maybe Juliana does, but I feel like we're in the crosshairs, but we're also the ones that if we continue to have our community rally and support us, we may be the ones that are the thoroughfare as well. We may be able to continue to do good work at a time. We just have to be very careful.
Julie, and any additional comments to that?
Just to agree and to say that, being on a college campus does not make us immune from any of these issues. But I think being a teaching museum is a fundamental commitment to critical debate. We must carry on. And indeed, as Marsha said, critical debate can happen through metadata, through changing terms in our database. One can continue to do that DIA work. And I just sort of remind myself and others I work with that we're playing the long game. We've been, keeping collections safe for hundreds of years, and we're not doing the work of 4 years or 10. We're doing the work for generations. And so if it goes slowly and if it is, not entirely visible to, in the sort of behind the scenes work, that's okay. We play the long game.
I have two more questions. I hope we have time for that.
I just want to
Brian,
add one thing I just want to add one item to that
sure.
discussion, and I think, it's not really a solution, but I think it's part of the problem, and it's something I've discussed before in some conversations, is there's this expectation that as a visitor, as a person entering a museum or cultural space, that I'm going to like everything that is in that space, and it's all going to speak to me, and that is just simply not the case. And honestly, those spaces where there is that diverse representation, there are different stories, there are different perspectives, those are the ones that are the most interesting. So part of the solution is, how do we set up our visitors for that experience? How do we manage the expectation that there are going to be things that may not align with their worldview, that may not align with their perspective, that may not align with their identity, but still can help them understand themselves better, and then in turn the people around them better. So I think that, and I don't have an answer for it, but it's something, I think we're all continuously grappling about, but it's that, managing that expectation that I think we have not been doing a great job at as cultural institutions.
Thanks. That is answering part of the question that I would ask, but I want to focus on something else. And maybe I did understand it wrong, because I was taken away with the things that's happening behind the scenes right now. But did you mention somehow that there was a kind of a tension between the work that you want to do in the community and how you address that with your staff?
Not a tension, but rather I think we can't address one without the other. And I think a lot of the focus with art museums in recent history has been on community engagement and our external relations. Yeah. But we have to look at the whole ecosystem, and part of the ecosystem is our team, our volunteers, our board, but also part of the ecosystem are the institutions that support us, the professional organizations that support us or don't support us, as well as the other parts of this pond that we swim in, which are the folks doing executive recruiting, the ones working with our boards, the consultants, all of these folks. And I think it's not, the conversation has not been holistic. The conversation has been sort of singular, and it's been needed. I'm not saying that work doesn't need to be done, but it needs to be done within this broader perspective, and looking at the entire range of people, communities, leadership that surrounds museums.
Yeah, it's quite a fine line. I understand that. Cindy, and maybe this is the last question, because we only have like 6 minutes left. I was really intrigued by your 4 pillars, and it's maybe some kind of a blueprint for others to look at, I would say, because and it looks very similar to things that, humbly I've done or tried to do. But so here is my question about the third one, which is seeding change, right? I said I come out of the science museum field, and there looks like there is a very obvious answer to that. And that, for example, how can you actually educate people to be resilient to the impact of climate change? Science is there to explain you stuff. How do you do a seeding conversation with a piece of art on an important actual topic? And did you have one before? And can you give an example?
Sure. I'll tell you about one that we're working on coming up. We have an artist, Christopher Myers, a Brooklyn-based artist, who will be doing an exhibition on migrant workers. And the conversation we think needs to happen in Michigan, the second largest state that has migrant workers, is, we need to talk about the pros and the cons. I think we get in silos and we talk to our own people about which one. So we're working with some local organizations that can talk to us from the migrant worker perspective and what they're providing, and the challenges they face. But we're also bringing in, so what burden does this have on a community? We want to have both perspectives. So we're inviting these panelists, and then we'll do small group conversations following that. It's related, of course, to the exhibition, but it's really about a community understanding its own community and being curious about how we work together.
I'm really looking forward to see that, and if we can hear about that in the future, would be great. So I'm afraid I have to stop here with questions because otherwise we'll not be able to hear Avi's conclusive remarks. But just to say thank you to all of the panelists and Marsha and Avi here for organizing this for us, and also that we have starting to touch on a number of very critical issues that we may be in the future become more and more critical, and we will not shy away from that conversation. So I will announce that right now. So Avi, to please give us your concluding remarks, and then we'll say goodbye to our audience.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the panelists. It's a very interesting conversation. I do want to step back a bit to situate our conversation in the larger discourse about museums in American life. Our art museums, including local art museums, are operating now in a global context, in part due to the globalization of contemporary creativity, in part to the rediscovery of past cultural exchanges and appropriations, and in part to discovery of art making among groups that have been underrepresented in traditional art museums and the art historical canon. This is certainly appropriate given the multicultural nature of our communities. It's also clear that art museums are not only part of the shift from being about something to being for someone, but we are central to that movement. As our art institutions become more visitor and community-centered, we need to adopt and cultivate new processes of teamwork, partnering, sharing authority, and co-creation. This last ranges from collaborating with artists and communities in developing exhibitions and programs, to drafting interpreted texts, to opening up arts workshops in new and experimental ways. We also need to come to terms with new ways of seeing. Just a generation ago, art museums promoted the museum way of seeing. But now, many, if not most of our on-site visitors view art through the lenses of their iPhones, and many access our visual resources online, never once seeing the original work of art. Our new digital culture will require us to find novel ways of helping our audiences to see and understand the meanings and valences of art as part of culture and society. Finally, as our speakers have suggested, art museums as community places need to engage communal life and issues. We often say that artists are pioneers in addressing social as well as aesthetic issues. We need to become forums for conversation about a wider range of ideas to maintain our relevance to new art, to new generations, and to new communities of service. This will, of course, require us to be experimental, flexible, open, honest, and fair. In short, if our art museums are to be centers of community, we will have to embody in our persons and in our institutions the humane values that make for a civil society.
Thank you, Avi. Thank you so much. I can't wait to organize our next session together with you and your ideas that you come up with. So as I said before, we are looking forward to dig deeper in things that we have touched upon today, and that probably in the coming months may become critical. And so we'll do that, and you will be informed about that. Thank you all for being here next month. And thanks for speaking about the digital dimension of this, because next month we are speaking about AI and museums. So be there for us on that time too. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.